Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader for our medical and laboratory business here at Intertek. On today's podcast, I'm very excited to be joined by Marco Fedeli from our medical assurance business. Hi, Marco. How are you?
Good. Thanks, Clarissa. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so happy to have you. So we love to kick it off by asking our guests to just tell us a little bit about yourself, how long you've been in the med industry, and what you're doing for Intertek now.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Marco Fedeli. I'm a consultant with the Intertek Assurance Group. I have about 20 years working experience with medical devices. I used to work for Intertek for 11 years. Then I went on to work in the retail industry, defense industry, then back with the medical device industry. And so now I'm back with Intertek as a consultant.
Yeah, so happy to have you back. Of course, you couldn't stay away from medical for too long, so happy to have you back on our medical assurance team. So the topic we're covering today, which I know has been something that we've received questions about, and there's things in the industry talking about this UDIs, right? We hear this phrase a lot. It's tossed around a lot in terms of requirements for med device manufacturers. So maybe you can share a little bit about what we mean or what someone would mean when they say a UDI, and why is that important to a medical device manufacturer?
Yeah, absolutely. So, today we're going to be talking about UDIs, and UDI stands for Unique Device Identifier. So shall we dig right in, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so the UDI is another required marking for medical devices. It must appear on the medical device and on every level of the device's packaging. So UDIs are required for compliance with US, EU, and other country medical device regulations. The UDI provides important information about a particular medical device. It has two forms and two parts. So let's talk about the two forms first. So the first form is the human readable form. This is just basically a string of alphanumeric characters. The second is the machine readable form. Some examples of this form can be a one-dimensional or two-dimensional barcode, an RFID, or some other method of machine readable communication.
And Marco, can I ask right there? You say you have to have both, right? The machine readable and the human, and that is, both of those have to be on every single level, as you mentioned, right? Like every single level of the packaging and the device.
That's right. There are some exceptions, and if you really dig in, if you consider the size of the device or maybe some other circumstances and also some national deviations, there are situations where you can get by with just one. This also may take into account the classification of the device as well. Mm-hmm. So that machine readable form, it simply just encodes the visible character string that we talked about earlier. And so that character string also has two parts. And these are the two parts we're talking about. So the first part is the device identifier part, and the second part is the production identifier part. So they are put together and separated by a data delimiter. So that device identifier, this is basically just a unique number that encodes the manufacturer, the model of the device, the number per pack, whether or not it's sterilized, whether it can be used in an MRI, and some other attributes as well. The production identifier provides production-specific information about that device. Some examples could be the manufacturing date, the serial number, the lot number, the expiration date, or other information that might be applicable. So the origins of the UDI go back to 2002 with the FDA. And the UDI objectives are the following. Basically, 1, reduce medical errors. 2, simplify the integration of medical devices with electronic data systems. Also provide a rapid method of identification and problem resolution for devices that have been associated with adverse events. And finally, provide the FDA and other regulatory authorities a method of efficient communication with the public about specific medical devices.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to note that, right? So you talk about, right, it's been over 20 years now, right, coming out in the early 2000s. So the industry's had a while to get used to this idea of having UDIs on their product and on their packaging, right? Why it's important when you talk about adverse effects or traceability or having, direct and open lines of communication and people being able to track products, right? It's so important in the medical device space, of course, as we see devices becoming more advanced or higher volumes of medical devices getting out there, right? It's just so important for the industry as a whole to have this traceability system.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So if a manufacturer is looking to do this on their own, if they're new to the medical industry or they haven't implemented a UDI yet, how do they start, right? I mean, where do you even go as a resource to get started with putting together a UDI?
Well, I think it probably starts with understanding where the regulatory requirements can be found and where they come from. So in the US, the regulatory requirements can be found in the Code of Federal Regulations, and that's 801.20, labeled to bear a unique device identifier. For the EU, they can be found in Article 27 of the MDR and also in Article 24 of the IVDR. So both of these UDI legislations provide information about the marking of devices, accessories, packaging, and also software. As far as how a manufacturer would implement the UDI, there's several steps that they can take. The process starts by obtaining a device identifier.
Of course, right? Start somewhere.
So this is issued by a recognized issuing agency. So there are 3 recognized by the FDA for the US, and there are 4 for Europe. So the manufacturer or the labeler must first open an account with these agencies, and then they have to enter many attributes about the device. These attributes can include, again, the manufacturer, the trade name, the model, packaging configuration, etc. All of these attributes generate a unique device identifier. This is the first part of the UDI character string. The next step is determining how to mark the device. In many cases, manufacturers incorporate the 2 forms of UDIs into the medical device's label and packaging artwork. Some cases, a separate label can be applied to the device and or the packaging. If the device is to be disinfected or sterilized between use or otherwise somehow reprocessed, then the UDI must be directly marked on the device. And some example methods are by laser etching or by engraving. So sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so I think it's interesting too, because when you talk about that, right, like laser etching or product, of course, we know accessories, disposable devices, medical, I mean, they come in all sorts of shapes, sizes, forms, right? So being able to etch it directly on the device, maybe you don't have the space or the landscape to be able to apply a label, right? There are a lot of ways to get around that or do things in another way to make sure you're meeting the requirement.
Absolutely. And you don't want, the way it's going to be cleaned or processed or sterilized to affect that marking. So that really determines the best method that you use to actually apply that marking to the device. So when marking the UDI, the production identifier always follows the device identifier. So once you get it on the device, then, that's a major milestone. The next step is, of course, registering the UDI.
Of course.
This must be done prior to the device being placed on the market. So in the US, the labeler enters the device identifier into the FDA's Global Unique Identifier Database. This is also known as GUID. In the EU, the manufacturer will one day enter the device identifier into the European database on medical devices. This is UDIMED. So that system is not ready yet. So registration currently is done as it was previously done under the MDD. Now, one thing to note here is that only the device identifier is registered.
Okay, that is important to note. And I think you mentioned too, and I hope people remember this, right? When we're talking about UDIs, is it's medical and IVD, right? You talk about the IVDR for the European Union, right? Making sure that they're following that same process and making sure that they're doing exactly what they need to be doing from an IVD perspective as well, not just a traditional, what we would think of as a medical device.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yes. Really important. So you mentioned, of course, that we have the US following a scheme, we have the EU following a scheme. You mentioned UDIMED, which, anyone in the industry, we've talked a lot about UDIMED over the past few years, right? When will it be actually required and implemented? It's, there's things out there already that you can use as a user. You can go on and view, things that have been made public, but are there other countries that we see following suit? I think we know, right, in most cases, if the US is pushing for something and the European Union is pushing for something, oftentimes we see global harmonization or people going forward to follow what the US and the EU are doing.
There are lots of emerging marketplaces for UDI, and there's some information that I will definitely share about that in a bit, for sure.
Yeah, awesome.
And they're all going to have, their own particular deadlines. And so, and one thing to probably consider here is that the US and the EU both implemented a staggered implementation approach. Okay, and so that basically started with class 3 devices being scheduled first, followed by class 2 devices, then ending with class 1 devices. And so in the US, the deadline for class 3 UDI was September 2014. And this was followed by class 2 devices in September 2018. And finally, the class 1 UDI deadline was set out to be in September 2022. This was extended a little bit. So the EU's deadline strategy was similar to the US's. Deadlines for class 3 UDIs led the group in May 2021. This was followed by class 2A and 2B in May 2023. And finally, class 1 is scheduled out into May 2025. So the EU registration deadlines will, of course, depend on that implementation of the UDIMED system and specifically the device UDI module, like we were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming up on that 2025 date here, probably sooner than we know. And right, we see both of them employing a similar strategy, right? Starting with the highest risk devices, as we generally see with anything that the regulatory agencies are doing, making sure that they're focused on devices that are the highest risk before moving on to the others. So really good intel on the dates and what people should be aware of. Another question that we get sometimes with manufacturers is trying to understand, is every UDI different for every single product that's going out the door? Is it in batches? Is it in groups? Is it, everything that's the same sample size? How do you understand the determination or the requirements for how does each UDI work?
Well, there are different regulations for the US and EU. The EU, for example, uses something called a basic UDI, which creates a product type or a product template. But ultimately, that individual product number, that device identifier, is something that is generated by the system, taking into account a number of different attributes. And we'll get into what attributes will actually mandate or trigger the generation of a new UDI. There are also requirements for legibility and size and so forth. So a specific size of the marking is not really mandated by the UDI regulations. But the regulations and the legislation does require that a human readable form have both device identifier and production identifier that are printed separately but clearly. And also something that is very important to note is that each issuing agency has different formats for the information. So the data delimiters are different and also the date codes. And so manufacturers should really pay close attention to this. Some dates are required to be in the Julian format, which I had to look up. I didn't even know how that worked. Also, there are some international standards that are recommended for testing the readability of the machine-readable codes. So these include the ISO IEC 15416, 15415, and the TR 29158 standards. So the general titles of these standards are Standards for Information Technology, Automatic Identification, Data Capture Techniques, and they include barcode print quality test specifications for linear two-dimensional systems, as well as direct part mark quality guidelines. Good information in there.
Yeah, so if someone is maybe concerned about making sure that their barcode or however they're doing it is legible, they can use either one of those standards or any one of those set of standards to test and be sure. Yeah,
absolutely. And back to your question about how are these numbers generated and how does a manufacturer know what to put on a US product and the EU product? There is an effort of global harmonization. The EU and the US UDI system, it was established through collaborative work at the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. So for the most part, they are identical. However, there are slight differences. They exist. I mean, actually, there are over 50. So one example is that basic UDI that we spoke about earlier. But there are also differences in the number of mandatory and voluntary data elements that a manufacturer has to enter for their device. So these attributes contribute to the generation of that device identifier. Also, there's slight differences on whether both a product and a packaging require the UDI in certain situations. The other national health authorities that you were asking about earlier that are also developing UDI regulations include Brazil, China, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Turkey. Australia is also expected to publish UDI regulations in the near future. The future will tell how these different systems will interoperate.
Yeah, and as we see with a lot of things, right, as I said, people tend to follow the US and the EU in a lot of instances, right, in this effort for harmonization, right? We look a lot at the IMDRF. They're really always working towards pulling the industry together, harmonizing what we're doing. So that's super beneficial. One question before we go, is there anything that manufacturers need to do on an ongoing basis? Is it a once you're done, you get your UDIs out there, or are there things that you were expected to be doing as a manufacturer on a regular basis?
Well, manufacturers, this is a constant process. So, and it is a emerging and very impactful concept. It directly affects every medical device that is manufactured and sold. National health authorities across the globe, it's obvious, they recognize the value and the utility of the UDI system by virtue of them investing significant resources and ensuring that this is scalable on a global level. So to stay in compliance, I would say a manufacturer must keep up to date with the emerging regulations and their differences. Also, they should be mindful of new technologies and systems that are being applied to UDI markings. Finally, a manufacturer must understand their role really in registering, storing, managing, and sharing information about every individual device that they place on the global market.
Yeah, I think that's such a good key point that you put there, right? Like, even if you're using an external agency, right, you're obviously working with these groups that issue the UDIs for you. It's still ultimately always going to be the manufacturer's responsibility. You have to keep track of it. You are the ones who have to make sure that you understand how many products you have going out there, what the requirements are for UDIs, because at the end of the day, it does come back to the manufacturer.
That's right.
Yeah, always an ongoing process in medical. It's never when you're done, you're done. It always keeps going and moving forward. Well, before we end, I have to say too, we did do a webinar on this topic because there are a lot of technical questions and in-depth technical information. So if anyone wants to check that out, that's available on our intertek.com/medical website. And if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out direct, and I'm happy to connect you with Marco or anyone from our team. Thanks so much, Marco.
Thanks for having me, Clarissa. Hope to talk with you soon.
Absolutely.